Okay. So, thank you for taking the time to let me interview.
Sure.
I'm talking about the current disaster in Japan
Mhm.
and how the radiation poisoning might travel over here. So, I just had a few questions about what you thought about the potassium iodine pills in the regards to the radiation problem.
Mhm.
So, my first question is, do you feel the recent disaster in Japan will result in radiation traveling to the U.S.?
Yes, I definitely do. In fact, it's already traveled to the U.S. So the thing about radiation is that it can be detected at such minuscule levels. I mean, the slightest increase in background radiation ought to be detectable. So will radiation make it to the U.S.? Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I'd heard in the news, and again, I don't follow it too closely, but I heard in the news that it really is, as early as about a week after the accident, there was already radioactively detected in the Pacific Northwest. Another thing, by about 2 weeks, it was in England too. They detected it in London. So
In some of the
there
water.
will be, well, it was atmospheric, because in the northern hemisphere, the prevailing winds blow from the west to the east, and they circle the whole globe, and so anything released anywhere along that is going to be carried, downwind, and it's very reminiscent of people my age remember the atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons by China and the Soviet Union, by the United States also. And the same thing happened. I remember as a kid, being aware of the news of, milk in the Pacific Northwest being radioactive and things like that. What really wasn't clear as to what the levels were. And I guess that's the important point. I mean, you can detect radiation at vanishingly small levels, but there's natural radiation, coming from all sources, from outer space, from rocks. Probably the biggest source is radon in building materials and certain rocks, which some people are exposed to. There's therapeutic uses of radiation. By radiation, of course, we're talking about ionizing radiation, not, the type of radiation that's, radio and TV and light, for that matter. Yeah, so it will definitely get here. The question is, what are the health risks associated with that? Are there any significant health risks? And that's the big question. I mean, I don't know. Insofar as it's possible to correlate the risk of, of cancer and other radiation-associated diseases, there doesn't seem to be any lower limit, right? I mean, so high doses of radiation will definitely cause cancer. Low doses cause less. Even lower doses cause less. If you sort of extrapolate down to vanishingly small doses, does that mean a vanishingly small increase in the risk? I mean, there's no reason to think that's not true. So, I mean, it's a reason for concern, and for monitoring, although I don't think we're anywhere near the point where certainly no panic or no extraordinary measure need to be taken. The level of radiation reaching the U.S. at this point is so low that it's not really a concern. I don't think, from what I follow in the news, that they're getting as much airborne release as they used to. It's mostly in the water.
So do you think that there is a need for these potassium iodine pills that everyone's trying to buy out everywhere?
No. No. For several reasons. One is that, my understanding is the level of radioactive iodine, or we're talking about iodine-131, which is, it's a common product of the decay of uranium and plutonium and the kinds of things that are in nuclear power plant fuel. That the levels of iodine-131 are very low, very, very, very low. Nowhere near the kind of exposure that the government, like the FDA some time back, published figures for how much, in the event of, mostly in preparation for nuclear power plant accidents here in this country, published guidelines for public safety officials and for medical professionals as to what kind of level of exposure to radioactive iodine would necessitate the use of, the advisability of distributing potassium iodide tablets at a certain dose for certain groups of people. And we're not even on the chart yet in terms of that level of exposure. The other thing to keep in mind about radioactive iodine is that it's just one of many radionuclides released from the decay of these materials. Again, I'm not an expert, but I think it's only a small percentage of the radioactive material that could potentially be released when in an accident of this sort. And the potassium iodide pills would only protect against iodine radionuclides like iodine-131, not the vast majority of radioactive material that is co-released with iodine.
Okay.
And then the other thing to keep in mind is that iodine-131 has a particularly short half-life. It has a half-life, I think, like 8 days or something like that. So by 3-4 half-lives, by 3-4 weeks later, probably there's almost none left in the environment. It just naturally decays.
Okay.
So, you know.
And how, could you explain, do you know how the potassium iodine, the theory behind it, how it's supposed to prevent cancer from the iodine entering the body?
Yeah. Uh, Iodine-131 is a particularly energetic emitter, I think, of beta particles, also some gamma rays, and so it does cause damage to cells, it causes mutation, and it does cause cancer. And it's incorporated into in the thyroid gland, because the thyroid gland concentrates iodine. It's, as we discussed in the class, it's the only place in the body where the dietary requirement for iodine seems to be necessary. And so the basic idea is very simple. If you just flood the body with non-radioactive iodine, potassium iodide, at the recommended doses, there's so much non-radioactive iodide, it just floods the system, and so the amount of radioactive iodine that can be absorbed is just diminished. It just becomes a tiny percentage of the total iodine in the body. So it's just saturating the system with iodine, with iodide ions, actually, which prevents and dilutes the radioactive iodine.
Okay, so what would happen if people just out of fear were to ingest too much iodine or potassium? Are there any negative side effects?
Well, yes. It depends on the dose. Now there are, as I understand it, doses. The greatest risk is for children and pregnant women, where iodine is being incorporated into the thyroid gland of the fetus and of small children and babies at a high rate because they're rapidly growing, and as we discussed in class, thyroid hormone, which contains iodine, is necessary for body growth. So, so there's a dosage schedule where small children and babies should certainly get a certain level. It's a small dose, based on their body weight, essentially. Partly based on the body weight, partly based on how active their thyroid gland is. So I think generally people under 40, if they were exposed to high levels of radioactive iodine, would be advised to take potassium iodide tablets. People over 40, not so much. Or at least the level of exposure to iodine-131 would have to be really high before somebody over 40 would be recommended to take potassium iodide. So given that these are extremely low levels, probably, almost certainly nobody over 40 should even be thinking about taking the tablets. The level isn't that high. And probably nobody under 40 either. I mean, the levels are that low. But, so you're asking about the negative side effects. Well, the good news is that if you take it as directed in the amount that is recommended, apparently, it's not very toxic. There's a small percentage, I think 1 or 2% of complications, which are relatively mild. There's some kind of inflammation of the salivary glands. There's gastrointestinal symptoms, and some rashes. I think there's a couple of rare conditions where the reaction can be more serious. And also some people are allergic to, they have allergies to iodine, which can be a problem. But altogether, these represent just 1 or 2% of the people that take the doses in the recommended therapeutic amounts.
Okay.
So it's relatively minor and considered relatively safe, especially if there really were like a nearby nuclear power plant accident or, God forbid, a nuclear weapon detonation, that the benefits of being protected from high levels of radioactive iodine would far outweigh the small risk. So it's relatively safe. What I would worry about, and I haven't heard any stories to this extent, what I would worry about is people taking super high doses, figuring like, well, if 1 pill is good, then maybe 10 pills is better,
Yeah.
Because it's not so much the iodine, but perhaps even the potassium itself can be toxic, because the body needs potassium. It needs it in relatively small amounts compared to other ions that are needed, and levels of potassium in the blood are important to maintain at relatively low levels for the functioning of nerves and muscles, and massive overdoses of potassium could cause a lot of problems with brain function, nerve function, with the heart, muscle activity, and so on. I don't know how much you'd have to take to cause that kind of a problem where you have to down a whole bottle of these pills at once or something like that, but
We won't try that.
that would be, the kind of thing that would